Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and today I have a video on the Brawler beta in the Lord of the Rings Online. And basically today what I want to do is check out the gameplay of the class, the base gameplay, not specialized. In future videos I will look at the red line and blue line that I plan to record next, but we're going to just go through some of the gameplay mechanics that you do have. And this will apply for brawlers that are at the level cap after you unlock all of your skills and they such, and again unspec'd and without any legendary item affixes or anything like that, just going with base regular weapons. So the goal of this video is to just kind of get a sense of the baseline gameplay and the fundamentals of the class really. As we go throughout this, I will also be giving some feedback that I have based on what we see, and I'll probably do some of my summarizing thoughts on that towards the end. So the very first thing I want to point out is I am at Galtrav at these training dummies because, well, it was less crowded. We have more people here now, but setting that aside, this is actually better than the training dummies you click because you can go out of combat and it's just easier to see what is going on, I believe, and also way less crowded. But anyway, these three skills are the ones I want to look at first. I will put probably the main skills that we look at for a while at the top here, just so we can see what's going on better, but a low strike, dexterous hook, and sinister cross. These are builders. If we look at them in the skill panel, which I will make a little bit smaller here, they're going to be here as our setup attacks, and they are the ones that build metal and do some baseline damage. Now, an important thing compared to my early beta experience is they seem to fix the differentiation between the quick attacks, balanced attacks, and heavy attacks. That was, I guess, not working correctly in the very first build that we had, and it seems to be working properly, but it used to be that these would actually count as one of those skills, and it does not seem these base builders do. But they have a lot of effects going on with them. While you can just use them and do a little bit of damage while at it, they do have some extra effects. So, because they are setup skills. And what they set up is going to be your metal spinders. So the first one I want to check out is Low Strike. If I use that and then Smash, which is going to be a metal spender, this is probably going to be the most basic one. That's the one we'll look at now. If I use Smash, you will see that he gets a vulnerability. There we go, there's the vulnerability debuff. Don't know what happened the first time I used it, but if I use it in rapid succession, he does get the vulnerable debuff. Now the vulnerable debuff only lasts 15 seconds and only makes them take 1% increased damage. I don't know if that's permanent, but that seems kind of weak to use that as a setup just to get that, especially when we look at the next setup skill, which is Dexterous Hook. This one increases the damage of the next metal spender. So I did forget to set up, I have the plugin combat analysis to take a look at the damage. So if we look at regular Smash, if I'm going to apply the vulnerable debuff, it did about 22,000 damage there. And if we can try to build some metal real quick, I will use Dexterous Hook and see if the damage is much different. It should be if it doesn't devastate there. We'll try to get a regular hit. Okay, there was a regular hit and it did about 30,000 damage instead of 22,000. That's about 30. That is about 1/3 more, or roughly 33% there. Now, one thing I noticed is there is a discrepancy between the text on the tooltip and between the description up here on the tooltip and the actual effect description it shows down here. Up here it shows 33%, which is very close to 1/3, and this is 35%, which is a little bit extra than 1/3. It also shows the duration is only 2 seconds, and another thing I notice here that is kind of annoying is an inconsistency between these three skills. Dexterous Hook is the only one that shows the actual buff. So if I use one and then Smash quite a bit later, or actually we'll have to build it up, but if I just wait a few seconds, we might not actually see it apply the vulnerability debuff because it probably only has the duration of 2 seconds. You have to use this right before you use one of these Mettle Consumers is the way that mechanic actually functions, but does not seem to be clear on these other two. But yeah, that is how Dexterous Hook functions, and in regular combat fighting regular mobs, this seems to be by far the best one to use, and basically always want to use Dexterous Hook as the setup ability. But next up we do have Sinister Cross, which is a little bit different. This one is actually going to tier up what are called innate strength buffs. Now, as an unspec'd brawler, these have absolutely no effect, but if I go ahead and load one of my trait trees, this one has the red line, fortunately. We can ignore all these other things I gained here. But the point is, we can look at what this innate strength stuff is, and you have similar thing for blue line, but I feel like the red line is going to be easy to look at because it is kind of damage based and kind of hard to do some tanking stuff on a training dummy. But this is what innate strength is. When you use these quick, balanced, and heavy attacks here that we have, you will essentially get a buff for damage, finesse, and critical rating. And the way to currently tell what are quick attacks and what are balanced attacks and what are heavy attacks. Well, as I mentioned, this was inconsistent in the early beta, but it seems to have been made actually functional on how it works. Now, these balanced attacks don't say anything about that in their actual tooltip, which is something I really don't like, and I think it should be very clear that they are actually balanced attacks. But these are all balanced attacks, these are all heavy attacks, and these are all quick attacks. And basically at this point, it's like good luck remembering that, especially because it's kind of annoying to have to pull up the skill panel to actually see if a particular ability is a quick attack or what. But yeah, that is what is going on with these, and I'll go ahead and close that. And essentially the point is, getting back to what we were even looking at, is Sinister Cross will make that, will give you 2 stacks of those buffs at once, 2 tiers of the buff at once, rather, instead of just the 1 tier that you would normally get. And I guess I should go ahead and unspec again so we can go back to the very baseline unspec'd gameplay that this is all about. So alright, that's how the setup skills work. Again, they just build 1 metal. It's a little bit slow building metal with just these, but that's the way it is. And then you have lots of metal consumers. So let's get those all up first. And they're all on my shift bar as well as this random one on control, and I'll have a note on that. Alright, so the way I've opted to display these is basically by the type of skills they are. Overhand Smash is a very basic metal consumer that just does damage to a single target. Then we have 2 AoE, Strike Towards the Sky, doing a lot more damage than Backhand Clout, but having twice as long of a cooldown. They both hit 3 targets. I will point out Strike Towards the Sky has a pretty low range because you hit enemies that are really right next to you. But next up, we also have some more utility-based metal consumers, is the way I have been thinking about these. They do typically lower damage than the ones we will see on the left, but have additional effects. Helm Crusher is going to stun the enemy, and the Vicious Knee will slow them, as we see, and Mighty Upheaval has a 50% chance to knock down the enemies, and Mighty Upheaval is an AoE, the other ones being single target. But anyway, these are all of the metal consumers, and as we can see just looking at the numbers on these, the strongest one is actually going to be Strike Towards the Sky, and the second strongest one, damage-wise, I mean, of course, is Helm Crusher. As far as single target damage, it actually does more than Overhand Smash, again, unspec'd here. I also realized I did forget the one that I had the note about, Fulgurant Strike here. And the reason I had a note about it is because it's an interrupt, but it costs metal, and that makes it kind of hard to rely on the brawler being able to interrupt anything. It already has a 30-second cooldown, so it doesn't seem like brawlers will be a big interrupt class, but still, I am not a fan at all of that consuming metal, and unfortunately I just don't quite like that. But I will point out it does pretty good damage. It would actually be the strongest single target metal consumers that the brawlers have unspec'd. But yeah, now that we have a general idea of what these do, I will go ahead and just use them. And we could actually look at the debuffs. I'll move Fulgurant Strike here. We can see the debuffs on the enemies, if any, actually do come. But the point here is just to see what they look like. There's the Strike Towards the Sky. We used Smash a couple times. Already just used that. Go ahead and use Backhand Clout once I build enough metal. And I guess at this point, I should go ahead and use, I have a cooldown that builds metal, but we'll get to those in a moment. There is Helm Crusher, did a lot of damage as we see, so it's actually going to the point of it being strongest numbers-wise for what we have right now. There was Knee Strike, that one gives the run speed buff. Now these buffs and debuffs are very hard to see for the brawler because they all have the same icon. It's not like that's actually easy to see on other classes anyway. You still have to hover over them without any plugins or add-ons or the such. But anyway, that's what these all look like. I guess we didn't use Fulgurant Strike. I keep forgetting about that one. But there we go. Use Fulgurant Strike. It's very quick. It's an immediate skill and interrupts. But anyway, those are those abilities, and they are the metal consumers. Now, about the strongest one, this actually will be more impacted by the trait trees, but out of what we have here, Strike Towards the Sky is one you want to use as frequently as possible, it seems. Now, one other note that we haven't gone over is, again, the Strike Towards the Sky and Mighty Upheaval here are the heavy attacks. Overhand Smash is our only balanced attack, and then we have lots of quick attacks over here. It seems like all of the utility ones, except Mighty Upheaval, of course, that one being an AoE, all of these utility ones are more quick attacks except that one. So the general baseline flow of gameplay that we have built up at this point for the Brawler is to build your metal. We'll go ahead and build some and then probably use Dexter's Hook and then use the one that has Uppercut. I always call it Uppercut. If you do hear me say that, I call it Uppercut because the icon actually says Uppercut and I just go towards that. But Strike Towards the Sky is our strongest one. So if we build metal and then use 2 Dexter's Hook for that setup, or unfortunately the training dummy decided that was not going to happen here. The point is that seems to be our strongest combination. Now when that's on cooldown, for a single target I might want to use the Dexter's Hook setup and then use Helm Crusher right away, get that bonus damage, and use the next strongest one we have for a single target here. Now, I do think it is important to point out and remember that you have these other setup skills. So assuming balance will probably change of all these abilities and the such, and they might actually change how these setups work because this is an early beta, it is good to keep in mind that you have these other abilities and they do have their own setup effects. It's just right now, early in the beta, Dexter's Hook is the, by far it seems like, strongest effect and one you want to use on most of your skills, unless you do want to quickly build up your innate strength buff, or unless you want to go ahead and put 1 debuff of them, making them vulnerable so they take more damage. That's of course going to be useful in longer fights and the such. But anyway, I do think it's a good time to go ahead and move on and look more at the cooldowns that we have as brawlers. Okay, so the first skill here I actually want to point out is Hurl Object. It technically does have a cooldown, but I wouldn't really consider it a cooldown ability. But this is the one ranged ability that brawlers have 25 meter range at baseline, and it actually does relatively decent damage. It actually crit a lot there, but compared to a basic builder, it does more damage than that. It doesn't quite do as much as, say, something like Smash as a baseline Mettle Consumer, but it does do moderate damage and is a ranged ability, also does debuff the run speed of the enemy, so thought I would go ahead and point that one out. But we'll move on to the real cooldowns, and first we have the offensive ones, damage-based ones here at the top, middle, and then at the top right are the defensive ones, and then utility ones here on the bottom right as it is. But anyway, we can go ahead and go to the offensive ones, and there are actually all of them I would say are short cooldown here, 1 minute or less. But going in order, we have Quick Feint, which builds metal and increases melee damage. Now Flex says it regenerates metal, but the actual buff that it shows is plus 25% damage. So the way to find out what it actually does is just use it and see what happens. So we have the plus 25% damage, but we also have 1 metal per second is how that works. So it will generate metal even if it doesn't say it down here in the actual effect portion of the tooltip. Next, oh yeah, there's also this current bug with the particular beta brawler that will be fixed later, that some things with the brawler cause fireworks to spawn, which is quite fun, but I unfortunately think it will be removed. Anyway, setting that distraction aside, we have next up is Raw Fury, which gives increased damage to your basic strikes. So let's go ahead and use that and actually see what happens to these basic strikes. The good way to do this, for people unfamiliar how I'm anchoring all these, you can press the H key and it actually saves the state of them when you press the H key. So something I can do here is use that buff, and then I'll press the H key again on these and see what happens. And unfortunately, it looks like the actual damage of them did not change. So yeah, I'm actually not too sure what happened there. I don't think I actually got a buff from that, if I remember correctly. I'll try to go in combat just to double check that that is actually a working thing and not completely non-functional. I honestly don't remember from my early beta experience anymore. But moving on, we do have the next buff, just decreases attack speed, but applies to the whole fellowship and is over 30 seconds. That is kind of crazy. And I think it could create some interesting dynamics, probably stack it with like captain buffs if you have a guardian using his, basically the guardian version of Oathbreaker, all that sort of stuff. If you line up cooldowns, that could just add and pile onto that with that crazy attack duration buff that lasts quite a while. Okay, so it looks like this ability is off cooldown, so I'll get in combat with the training dummy and see I did not get any buff. So that is a little bit odd. I'm going to double check. You temporarily forgo all technique in order to launch a series of basic strikes with furious strength behind them. Set up attacks, gain damage for 10 seconds. So that cooldown is not working at all, and we cannot see what sort of damage they gain. Have no idea the actual function of that, because the tooltip doesn't give too much description. It doesn't even have any effect description, probably because it doesn't actually have any effect right now. So hopefully that's going to be a working thing in the future. But moving on, we have, defensive cooldowns. So unfortunately, the Brawler it feels squishy is the way I would describe it. It has a lack of self-heals, and this is just something a lot of other classes have eventually had essentially in the games, some form of self-heals that aren't cooldown based. But one that the Brawlers do have is a 5-minute cooldown skill that restores quite a bit of morale, 35%. It also decreases incoming damage and gives you an extra buff of 5% damage per metal at the time of casting, so you get to reduce your damage even more if you cast it at full metal. But the problem, I guess, with that is you just want to use it when you're really low on morale. Ideally, sometimes you can't line that up for when you happen to have a lot of metal. But anyway, the next buff is going to be a mitigation buff, and it actually buffs you based on how many allies you have nearby. The more allies, the more mitigation buff you gain, starting from 2% up to 10%. So with a full fellowship, you'll get a 10% mitigation buff for whatever duration that is. Let's actually see the duration. It's a 30-second duration, and at baseline, it looks like it is 1% to both physical and tactical, again going up to 10%. Alright, the last set of abilities we have here are the last two cooldown ones, which are utility ones. This one is just as simple, removes debuffs from you. It removes one debuff and has a 20-second cooldown, which I think is in line with a lot of other classes. And then Slip Free is just going to remove you out of crowd control. I will say this was buggy in my experience early on, and that it actually, or I think the problem was it was not usable when stunned, which is kind of hard to get out of a stun, which is what it's supposed to do when you are stunned and it doesn't let you use it. But anyway, that's a bug that we can assume or hope would be fixed by the time the Brawler actually comes out. And yeah, that is the basic idea of all the abilities for the Brawler. So again, the general gameplay we have right now, if I mix in everything and actually use my cooldowns and use cooldowns that work, unlike this one, is I probably ideally want to actually stack all these up, but you can stack all of them up and try to get a really big hit out of your abilities. Could do smash here, but I don't actually have innate strength stuff. That's something you would have when you respect. And I guess the big thing that I'm actually missing right now is using the first setup ability called Low Strike to get the 1% increased damage debuff, and otherwise just trying to end all my Mettle Consumers on 2 for the bonus damage. And that's probably something I would do spec'd even with innate strength. But yeah, that is the gameplay flow for the Brawler. I could actually fight something a little bit longer instead of just talking about it. And alright, so I will just sit here kind of using my abilities some as just sort of background while I talk a little bit of a summary of my thoughts from the Brawler experience so far. Again, unspec'd gameplay. I know I keep repeating that, but it is important that this is not spec'd. So at a baseline level, I actually think the flow of gameplay feels pretty good overall is how I would describe it. The idea of using these metal builders and then going to use consumers is something that is not new to the Brawler, but the way it does it with the setup abilities I think adds an interesting twist to me. So you, again, wanting to line up specific abilities before you actually execute the metal consumer and doing them right back to back as it is, I think that creates an interesting dynamic that is not quite present in other classes. Now, I do have a few problems or sources of feedback, I guess, is a lot of these metal consumers feel like they go underutilized, and this will become more of a problem when we actually get spec'd into the bread line. But some metal consumers just feel underutilized. There are a lot of them, but again, we have a few that provide utility. An example is Backhand Clout. Everything about this is just unexciting, and it's kind of hard to actually get use out of it. I guess the big thing is it's something that has a short cooldown, so if you are in longer fights and maybe in actually AoE situations where I would want to use this, when Strike Towards the Sky is off cooldown, maybe would use it a little bit more rather than these other single target abilities. So I could actually see that being pretty decent, but it's one I've noticed I've probably used it the least. Something like Vicious Knee, I don't think decreasing the enemy run speed is exciting. This otherwise, I really like the ability, so it's something I want to like. I want to use it frequently just kind of for its unique animation. There are not many kick animations with the Brawlers. I feel like that's something also a little bit underutilized in the gameplay and just assets they have. And I would be more interested if this did some sort of other debuff that made it more useful and something you would regularly want to use. I also think having these other more utility-based metal consumers be more useful and make them more utilized could vary up the gameplay a little bit with the consumers that you use. So that's just my early feedback based on my current gameplay experience, which honestly isn't all that much. We're kind of with this set of videos that I'm doing with the Brawler like right at the end of beta is really the chance I'm getting an extra hour or two to take a deeper dive and learn with you all. So I know this type of video is actually going to be a little bit different because it's not really a guide, it's also me learning at the same time, but I hope the flow and format is helpful for y'all. Anyway, that is kind of beside the point. I want to go into a little bit more feedback I do have, just some specific notes I actually have on the Brawler. Number one is the tooltips need finishing. That's kind of an obvious thing. The icons also need finishing as another obvious thing, but there's a lot of things that are not clear that I think need to be put in, and I think it is important to explicitly state them just so it's not forgotten. So number one is making these consistent and have all of them say what Dexterous Hook already says about the actual duration and effect, the green text part of it essentially, need to be in these other two. I also think every single skill that is a quick attack, balanced attack, or heavy attack should say so and be pretty clear in the icon for it. It also would be pretty neat if they are somehow the actual icon for them are maybe different colors so you could learn which is which. For example, you could have red, green, and blue maybe. I'd see some red, green, and blue skills already. But I would love some sort of visual way to differentiate them without having to actually memorize it. I guess I could organize my bars that way, but it is something that I would really like to see with the icons. I don't know how feasible it is, or if people who actually also play the class would have a similar opinion, but it is one note I have. It would be really nice to be able to differentiate these in a visual way without either having to look at the tooltip, which I think it should be put in the tooltip, or without especially having to open up the skill panel. That's probably the most annoying part of that with the quick, heavy, and balanced attacks. Okay, so the next set of specific feedback I have is on Fulgurant Strike, and I already mentioned this, but I don't think it should consume metal. You can change the damage if it's too overpowered by not having to cost metal, but I think it should just be a base ability like the corruption removal and not cost metal. I would much prefer that skill there. Also, a note on the corruption removal, just because I just kind of reminded myself of it, is it does a lot of damage, and it's kind of surprising, but it's something you might want to use, I don't know, regularly, but could have some potential use just because it does a lot of damage if you can't use anything else. One more note I do have on cooldowns, actually. This is going to be the defensive cooldown. Something I feel is missing is an evasion-based skill. So I think evading attacks is something that would be really thematic towards the Brawler, kind of dodging around enemy attacks while you're trying to punch them and the such. And I feel like it would be very thematic if there were a defensive cooldown that somehow boosted evade. Maybe it's like actually a short duration and short cooldown one. The kind of thing I am envisioning here is maybe a 20-second cooldown and maybe 5-second duration evade buff. It allows you maybe to predict when you're going to start taking a lot of attacks and use it with that in mind as a sort of like as an ability that utilizes player skill some, and I think it would add some flavor to the Brawler. That's just something I feel like is missing and would love to see something like that. Alright, at this point, I know these notes are getting like very random and just things as I think of them, and kind of remind myself actually what I have thought in the past. And one thing I would really like to see is a run speed buff. I feel like that would be thematic towards the Brawlers, and like if you get, I think the way I described it is in over your head in a fight, you could like book out of there really fast. I think a run speed buff would be pretty nice. Now, flavor-wise or class fantasy-wise, I don't know how self-heal would fit into this class, but it just feels like something that is lacking. Maybe it could be, like I mentioned with the evade cooldown, if you had something like that, maybe there could be a mechanic where when you evade attacks, you get a self-heal. I think the burglars actually have a blue line thing kind of like that. I think that is maybe a way it could be implemented where it's not like the Brawler is actually healing, but something like that I think could improve the situation where it just really feels like they need some sort of self-healing. Another way that could be implemented for a self-heal is something meditation-like. I don't know how this would actually work in combat. Probably wouldn't be too well in combat. Maybe they could have an out-of-combat meditation type thing, but I think that might be more towards Eastern fighters, and I'm not quite sure the Brawler fits into that type of thing. Maybe it does, but just another thought I had. But yeah, at this point, I have basically covered everything I've wanted to about the gameplay. Again, I hope this type of format has been helpful for y'all, but one thing I want to do is go ahead and preview my next two videos that will be on the Brawler, and I will essentially do the trait analysis type videos I do, but more in of a style where I also will be learning the mechanics and giving feedback kind of like this video on the traits and all the stuff inside the two specs. So look forward to that coming sometime in the future. And otherwise for this video, that is all I have. Again, hope y'all did find it helpful and enjoyed it, maybe just seeing some of the Brawler. And if you do have any, please leave any feedback. Otherwise, if you did enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content, and thanks for watching everyone.